The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, a brief summary. The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 was a watershed event in the history of Minnesota, yet it remains largely unknown or misunderstood. On August 18, 1862, a faction of the Dakota people launched an attack against the settlers, traders, and agents living at the Lower Sioux Agency in present-day Morton, Minnesota. They then spread out throughout south and southwestern Minnesota, terrorizing many settlements. After the first day, the Dakota killed several hundred settlers while taking about 250 white and mixed-race captives. At the time of the attacks, the Dakota were poor and starving and decided it was time to fight for their survival. For many years they had suffered at the hand of an unjust, corrupt, and ineffective treaty system. Treaties, such as the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed in 1851, stripped the Dakota of their land, culture, and ways of life. Treaties were agreements that moved the Dakota onto reservations while offering them annuities, goods, and services. However, payment of annuities was often delayed, withheld, or stolen by means of fraud and corruption by avarice traders. Also, the Dakota were forced to take up farming and to give up their traditional ways of dress, speech, religion, and living. This forced assimilation, along with corruption and fraud, led to the wretched conditions that eventually broke out in war. Following the initial attack on August 18th, the Dakota launched 2 attacks at Fort Ridgely and 2 at New Ulm. Both these were repelled by settlers and volunteer militia. Soon, reinforcements arrived at Fort Ridgely in the form of Henry Hastings Sibley and about 1,600 mostly volunteer militia sent from Fort Snelling. Lacking resources and torn by factionalism within the tribe, the Dakota were forced to retreat along with their captives north and west along the Minnesota River. On September 2nd, the Dakota, who had returned to the area to recover goods left behind in their retreat, launched a successful assault on a burial party of soldiers at Birch Coulee. The battle lasted about 33 hours before reinforcements forced the Dakota to retreat once more. The final battle of the U.S.-Dakota War occurred at Lone Tree Lake on September 23, 1862. The Dakota were defeated and forced to flee or surrender. The captives, many of whom were kept safe by those Dakota who did not favor the war, were released and the remaining Dakota were taken prisoner. A military commission was established, and in the weeks that followed, the commission put on trial 392 Dakota and sentenced 303 of them to death by hanging for their roles in the U.S.-Dakota War. However, the majority of the proceedings were done in haste, with as many as 40 being tried in one day. The convictions were reviewed by President Abraham Lincoln, who deemed them too harsh and approved only those sentences of men proven to have participated in violent crimes. As a result, on December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota Indians were hanged in Mankato, Minnesota, in what remains the largest mass execution in United States history. All remaining Dakota Indians, many of whom did not take part in war, were imprisoned at Fort Snelling and eventually expelled from beyond the borders of the state of Minnesota forever by act of Congress in March of 1863. The U.S.-Dakota War was a tragic event for Dakotas and settlers alike that has left a permanent stamp on the history of Minnesota. Today we are still struggling to understand and reconcile these unfortunate events.
We have to take care of our own hearts, and we have to not carry that heaviness, because if we do, we won't heal.
Minnesota's story today is one of survival.
We never could call home. I'm here. I'm still here.
Education, language revitalization, activism, and collaboration among Dakota people around the nation and in Canada help to tell the true story of Minnesota's past and the resilience of its first people.
This is our 5th year of the ride. It's to commemorate the 38 men who were hanged unjustly in Mankato, Minnesota in 1862.
And when they were on the gallows, they told the people, "Don't cry for us. What we did for you." That is why we're here today, 150 years later.
In August 2012, Dakota people from all over the Midwest and Canada marched from Flandreau, South Dakota to Pipestone, Minnesota in a ceremonial homecoming.
We all have our stories. What got us here? What's going to get us back here in another 150 years?
descendants of European settlers learn about their ancestors' relationships with the Dakota and investigate their family's history, survival, and connection to the land.
We are gathered here today on the 150th anniversary of the Dakota War to remember the settlers of Milford Township who lost their lives.
We owe it to them to never forget the sacrifices they made for succeeding generations and for the courage they displayed in overcoming the tragedy that struck them on this very spot.
These tribes have come together and they put this 4-day program together, which they call Dakota Iuha Owanjina, together as one.
We need about 30 paddlers, and we'd also have room for about 24 elders or others.
We're gonna paddle around Pike Island. That's the origin of the Dakota people. That's where we came from. That's the center of the universe.
It was the same waterways that our ancestors traveled, and it's just good to be part of that today.
This is your homeland. This is your land. Everybody from South Dakota, and Iowa, and Nebraska, all of this was yours. The water, earth, and air is yours. We're Dakota. They try to simplify us and put us behind boundaries and lines. We never fit there. We are water.
Together, people work on creating educational opportunities, historic awareness, and healing for all who call Minnesota home.
I want to say to my Dakota friends, welcome back to Minnesota today. Many wrongs were committed in the past. They cannot be ignored, and they should be remembered. We remember the past to make a better future.
All of us have to work together. Doesn't matter how that person is. Try to see the goodness in every person. If the whole world can do that, we can create an energy shift here.
In the mid-1600s, the Dakota bands were living and prospering in central Minnesota. French explorer Duluth reached them by 1680 and claimed the land for France. By the mid-1700s, conflict with enemy tribes over hunting territory caused the Dakota to migrate west and south. This resulted in the formation of the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota divisions of the tribe. The Medewakantuan Dakota allied themselves with the British after the French and Indian War. But 2 wars with the United States caused the British to lose their hold on Dakota territory, even as the Americans purchased French Louisiana and set their sights on dominating the tribes of the Northwest. By the treaties of 1837, 1851, and 1858, the Dakota of Minnesota were left with but a narrow strip of reservation land. Game was nearly hunted out, and their treaty monies were largely spent on reservation infrastructure, traders' claims, or else embezzled. By 1862, the situation had become intolerable. The Dakota warriors demanded that Little Crow lead them in a war. Through 6 weeks of fighting, some 800 white settlers and soldiers lost their lives. And on December 26, 1862, 38 warriors were hanged in the largest mass execution in U.S. history. The causes of the war were covered up by agents, traders, and politicians. Little Crow has been largely blamed for all of it, until now.
was born about 1812. He was of the Mdewakanton division of the Dakota Nation, and his band, the Kaposia, lived at White Rock, or present-day St. Paul. At the time of his birth, the Kaposia band was led by his grandfather, the famous Chayton Wakwamani. Chayton Wakwamani had a son named Wakinyantanka, or Big Thunder, and his first son was Talyate Duta, or his Red Nation. Hereditary Dakota chiefs often took on the honorary name of their ancestors. In Talyate Duta's case, he took on the sobriquet of Little Crow, the name by which his father and grandfather had also been known. While Talyate Duta was still in his cradle board, his father and grandfather followed the British commander Colonel Robert Dixon in Tecumseh in a war against the Americans. In 1819, when Talyate Duta was about 7 years old, he probably witnessed the passage of Colonel Henry Leavenworth and his soldiers on their way upriver to Mendota to build a new fort. Along with Leavenworth came the first Dakota agent, Lawrence Tolliver. Chayton Wakwamani was much impressed with Tolliver and traveled to Washington City with him in 1824. The following year, the chief signed the Prairie du Chien Treaty of Peace with the Americans as represented by Lewis Cass and Colonel William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. 8 years later, he was killed by the Ojibwe, and he was succeeded as chief by his son, Wakinyantanka. Talyate Duta was preoccupied with becoming a skilled hunter and warrior. He was taught that these roles were strictly ordered by Daku or Ka, that which is mysterious. He also cultivated his relationship with the spiritual realm. In 1832, when the Black Hawk War broke out, the Americans called upon the Dakota to support them in the fight against the Sac and Fox. Because the Sac and Fox were hereditary enemies of the Dakota, Talyate Duta joined the American Army and served as a scout. During the course of the war, he took a number of Sac and Fox scalps for which he received war honors. According to Dakota military tradition, warriors were awarded eagle feathers for success in killing and scalping enemies. It was of utmost importance to the Dakota to have warriors in perpetual readiness to defend tribal interests. Talyate Duta proved himself time after time and accumulated some 24 feathers by 1846. During this time, traders began to increasingly traffic in whiskey, and this caused village-wide drunkenness. Due to this kind of situation, it is not surprising that Talyate Duta got himself into trouble for an apparent liaison with a woman in his band. The elders of his village, perhaps to protect his life, banished him. Talyate Duta went out to live among the Wahpeton Dakota at Lac qui Parle. He soon joined the Kit Fox Soldier Society, which served his relative, Joseph Renville. Renville ran a trading operation on the upper Minnesota for the American Fur Company under Henry Sibley. He also became acquainted with Christian missionaries Stephen Riggs, Gideon Pond, and Thomas Williamson. He in fact learned to read and speak English.
Talyate Duta is the most distinguished, both as a warrior and hunter of all the young men. He says he wishes to be a Christian, but cannot.
While at Lac qui Parle, Talyate Duta married 3 daughters of the Wahpeton chief, Inyangmani, or Running Walker. He later married a 4th.
Little Crow came to here, our community, and chose 4 daughters of my great-great-grandfather, Inyangmani, as his wives.
In late 1845, word came that his father had accidentally shot himself and died at Kaposia. He also heard that one of his half-brothers was hoping to become the next Little Crow chief. Taliateduta determined to take up his rightful position as chief of the Kaposia band. He gathered up his family and canoed downriver in the spring of 1846. The elders agreed to forget his past and accept him as the legitimate chief. However, two of his half-brothers agitated against the decision. One of the brothers became so angry that he shot Little Crow point blank. Taliateduta managed to raise his arms just before the shot was